The Royals only had one All-Star representative last year, but who is it going to be for 2024? I'm going to tell you next on Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. We're also live on TikTok and Instagram, so go and check us out over there at Locked_on_Royals. Just started getting a lot more busier over on those accounts. If this is your first episode ever tuning in, well, my background here in sports is I work in Kansas City at Sports Radio 810 WHB. I've got a show once a week over there, and I've got a show Monday through Friday on ESPN Kansas City, so I stay pretty busy with all things sports, not just with this podcast. And today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. We'll have more coming up on them in about 10 to 15 minutes or so, but it's the perfect time to go over there and create your account. Get it done even before spring training rolls around, because there's stuff to bet on now. There is a lot of stuff in-game that you can bet on, so no better time to jump in on the action than right now with FanDuel. It's also pretty easy to find us on all those podcasting platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and on Google Podcasts, as well as YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. We're over 600 subscribers now, so the next goal is to get to 700 around Christmas time, I would say. So if we can get to 700 by then, we'll have 2.5 months, maybe 3 months to get to 1K, which was always our goal that we set out for when we began this podcast back in late June, or at least when I took over this podcast back in late June. So easy to find us on all those platforms, easy to find us on all those podcasting platforms, social media accounts. So go and give us a follow everywhere across the board on that for the Locked On Royals podcast on the Locked On Royals Network. Well, today is going to be another look ahead to the future. And though it's not in the immediate, and though it's more so of a prediction, a projection than anything, I think it's something that is worth going over. Because what we have seen in the last, give or take 5 years, is that the Royals are, one, out of it by the All-Star break. There has not been a single season since 2017 where the Royals have been entertaining all the way up into the All-Star break. The closest thing, and seriously, the Royals have to being fun was 1 month of baseball in April back in 2021. That was when they had the best record at 16-9. Everybody was starting to buy in just a little bit more. But in the end, we saw how that season closed out. And that was only winning, 72, 74 games. It wasn't much. But what I would say about the All-Star break, because to me, that is the goal. This is step one. I guess I should say step one is finding a way to start hot, just the way you did in 2021. Having a hot start really brings people in. I think your attendance is always going to be a struggle in April, right? It's going to be cold at Kauffman Stadium. They're going to be playing in Cleveland. They're going to be playing in Baltimore. They're going to be playing in Chicago. It's going to be cold. And attendance is always going to be tough then. So that attendance is going to suffer in April. But then if you're in it by May, you're in it by June, and you're in it by July, that attendance number really goes up. And that, to me, is kind of step one in this process. Because everybody would sit here and say, well, the goal is to be competitive throughout the entire season. Well, I do think that's more of a lofty goal. I just don't think right now they've got the roster to be a full season competitive bunch. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that when I'm talking to you 365 days from now, we're enjoying the best season they've had since 2017. But the only way, and I mean the only way that gets done, is if they do build a bunch of all-star candidates, even snubs at that. Because when you have a roster that is deserving of all-star appearances, it's only going to feed off the other players, right? Last year, the Royals had one all-star representative, and it was by default. And it was Salvador Perez, who wasn't really enjoying that great of a season. That's nothing to build on. If the Royals would have sent Bobby Witt Jr., or they wouldn't have been able to send, Carlos Hernandez, somebody that was thriving and was young, you would have felt better about the all-star break. But to me, the only way that this hot start can happen, this competitive play can continue into the all-star break, is if they've got a couple of homegrown all-stars. And you know what? I believe two of them, and I strongly believe two of them, are going to be going to the all-star game in 2024. One, it's Bobby Witt Jr. I think if there was the betting odds out there for Royals representatives, he'd be by far and away the number one candidate. Just because now he's on the map. He was a top 10 most valuable player in baseball. Now we know, even with a sluggish start to the season, I don't expect it to be a sluggish start, but if there was one, he is now the default. Salvador Perez, for a decade, was the default. The Royals didn't have anybody, send Salvador Perez. He's got the laundry list of accolades. He's been in the most all-star games. Just keep sending him, okay? Bobby Witt Jr. by far and away. He is the number one candidate on this team. I feel the safest about him being a candidate in the all-star game. Hell, I'd go as far to say I think he starts at shortstop. I really, really do. I know Bo Bichette is going to be great competition. Corey Seager is going to be really tough competition. But I don't know. I just think that we're about to see an incredible breakout year. You know, the breakout following the breakout, in which he becomes not only a top 10 player in baseball, gets top 5 MVP votes. He got an MVP vote this past year. And that was just because of a strong second half. Imagine what it's going to look like with a full season of great play. So he, number one, he's the runaway candidate. Number two, he was my pick last year. But injuries have been a problem in the first 2 years. But I will tell you this, if he is healthy, he's about as safe as a bet as Bobby Witt Jr. is. That's Vinny Pasquantino. I don't think he's a starter because I think there's too much talent at the first base and the DH position. But not to worry. I do think that he gets in at some point. Now, to me, it comes down to how the Royals are. If the Royals are not competitive, if they are one of the worst teams in the American League by the All-Star break, they're not going to send multiple guys to the All-Star game because the writing's right there. You lose that many games in the first half, you probably aren't having that many All-Star representatives. But to me, it's Vinny Pasquantino. Vinny Pasquantino, if he can stay healthy, might be the most consistent and pure hitter they have. And I will stand by that. I will die on that hill. Bobby Witt Jr. has the highest ceiling. He's got the highest potential. He also can have some pretty bad slumps. I don't see Vinny Pasquantino going through many bad slumps as long as he stays healthy. I know there's people that are concerned about, well, he is hurt all the time. Can you trust a guy to stay healthy? I do believe, if I was to bet money on it, I think this is going to be a full season of health for Vinny Pasquantino. I think the two injuries were kind of freak injuries. When you tear a labrum, you have a shoulder injury swinging the bat. It's not necessarily a super freak injury, but it's kind of an odd injury. You think of position players, knee injuries, groin injuries, hamstring injuries, ankle injuries, wrist injuries, shoulder injuries, those are pretty severe. But to get that surgically repaired, I feel confident that he's going to be healthy and could be one of the candidates. And then number 3, not much of a shock here. If you're going to send a pitcher, it's likely going to be Cole Reagans. And the only thing that would give me pause is, did we see just this flash in the pan? Did we see this guy come in and just light it up because there was no pressure? It was a shortened amount of time, 9 to 10 starts. He's got to make around 25 to 30 this year. So what is that going to look like when he knows he's got to pitch for an extended season? Not just, starting in the final couple months of the year. What is that going to look like? Because to me, that is going to be the big thing to watch. A very big thing to watch. And if he can be that guy that takes the next step, pitches a full year, then there's my 3 all-star representatives. But it also means they got to be competitive in the first half. So who do you think is the all-star representatives? Let me know in the YouTube comments below or on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. We're going to take our first break of the show. When we come back, who's going to be the closer in 2024? Or are they even on the roster right now? I'll tell you next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I am your host, Jack Johnson. You can always follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. We're also live on TikTok and Instagram at Locked_on_Royals. Before we go any further, let's give a shout out to the title sponsor today in FanDuel. Score early in the NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time to get on the action. The app is so easy to use, and there's a wide range of betting options that include spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. That's FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL. I believe we've had this segment, give or take 4 to 5 times. I would say the majority of it, though, came in the beginning of the season, or actually not the beginning because we took over this podcast midway through. The beginning of my time here on the podcast, I remember we revisited it. It was not long after the trade deadline when Scott Barlow was gone. The question became, well, who closes out games? I think the easy answer was Carlos Hernandez. And then we saw Carlos Hernandez start to struggle a little bit. And once Carlos Hernandez struggled, I think Matt Quatraro kind of just turned to closer by committee. There was no solid guy. There was no guy that had just been penciled in. Hey, if there's a lead in the 9th inning, not that there have been many this year, let's just try to get it to him. I mean, there were a couple of games. Matt Quatraro turned to Taylor Clark, of all guys. It really was just the hot hand. And in all honesty, that is what you do when you're losing 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106 games. You just do that because what value is there having a closer if you don't have the lead in many 9th inning opportunities? What's the value, right? You just hope that you have the right matchups, and that also may be the goal going into the season. I know that with Matt Quatraro, Brian Sweeney, Zach Bove, those guys, when they are looking at who can close it out, yeah, if you've got a lights-out guy, I mean, at the very end in September, the Royals always gave the ball to James McArthur because why? He was the best pitcher in the bullpen. He was not giving up any runners. He wasn't walking anybody. He was getting lots of strikeouts, swings and misses. He was by far and away, the guy. Now, again, I think you reevaluate that. You don't just go into spring training and say, James McArthur is the guy. It may be closer by committee to begin the year. It would not shock me in the slightest because, as I said, with Matt Quatraro, Bove, and Sweeney, they look at 9th inning and 8th inning and 7th inning kind of the same way. You know, if you need to use James McArthur in the 7th inning, well, you need to get out of a jam, use your best guy. And I'm hoping that James McArthur is not going into the season the best guy. I hope they can upgrade the bullpen just a little bit more where a second-year guy isn't the most trustworthy. But let's say he flourishes again. Let's say he's the guy again. And to me, that just basically means that you hit on a guy that nobody was really looking at. So the James McArthur story is a good one. It's one that I think you want to build a bullpen off of. But again, when you start off a season, I think everybody has in their mind, well, who's the closer? Now, and you'll see early on the first guy to get a closing opportunity, it could be Carlos Hernandez. Maybe it's Nick Anderson, who they just got through trade via Atlanta. Maybe it is James McArthur. Maybe it's a couple other guys they have yet to bring in. But to me, it is all about matchups, really, until the Royals are at the point where, one, somebody emerges as their by far and away best bullpen arm. I mean, that's the easy answer. If you've got a James McArthur type of September with one of your guys in April or May, you go to that guy. You don't play matchups when you have a guy that's that good. Just save your best arm and bridge the gap in the 6th, 7th, and 8th to get to that guy in the 9th. When you have somebody that can pitch like that, even if it's a bad team, if it's a team that's 10 games under 500, 20 games under 500, you have somebody that emerges like that, it's a no-brainer. You just give the ball to him in the 9th inning. But I'm also very curious how the Royals assemble this bullpen. That, to me, is going to dictate a lot. If they go out there here in the next couple weeks or so, the next month or two, and assemble a bullpen of 3 or 4 more new guys, well, I think differently now. I think differently about how they can close out games. Maybe you give it to somebody who has experience. Maybe you give it to somebody who's got the best pure stuff. Maybe you give it to the guy who has the best numbers. I mean, I even left out the name John McMillan. John McMillan could be a guy by June or July that's got the best pure stuff and has the best command at that point of pure stuff, and you roll with him in the 9th inning. But let's say the Royals go out there and get a Phil Maton. Let's say they get a Will Smith who has closed out games before. Let's say they get a Matt Moore to help them bridge the gap. At that point, then it kind of comes down to, all right, well, there's the experience route you can take. I think the Royals have done that before and in years past. You give it to guys who have closed out games before. They've got some success. They have pitched in big games in the 9th inning before, rather than just throwing somebody in the fire. But the good thing about it is I think there's a lot of good options, long-term value. John McMillan could be this team's closer in 2025. I mean, he's got the best stuff, I think, of anybody in the bullpen. When you throw that hard and you've got that hard of a slider, and if you can keep that command on point, there's going to be few teams that can square him up. I really do believe that. For me, and for I think the case of John McMillan, if he can stay healthy, you're looking at a guy that could be what Dylan Coleman kind of hoped he was. Somebody that threw that hard, really good secondary pitch, good command. And maybe that's another part of this. What if Colin Snyder and Dylan Coleman have really good springs? Do they kind of fit into the equation here? All of these things are something to wonder. And maybe I did bring up this segment just a little bit too early. You bring up this segment way too early. Well, then I may have a completely different answer next week. I mean, next week is the winter meetings. We're going to have plenty of coverage on that. I might have a totally different opinion in spring training. But for now, I think I would stay at, in April, it's going to be closer by committee. Now, until somebody emerges, I don't think the Royals are going to put one guy in one spot unless they go through free agency or they go through trade and get somebody who's closed out games before. Because right now, nobody has closed out games before for an entire season and done so with success. So for that reason, I think it's closer by committee. Unless free agent move happens, trade move happens, or somebody just blows the doors off everybody in spring training, and that's just the clear cut. He's the guy. Maybe it's MacArthur, maybe it's McMillan, maybe it's Carlos Hernandez again, because we all thought highly of him at some point. But again, with this bullpen, it is still a work in progress. It really is. I am not too caught up and worried about the upgrades just yet. We haven't even gotten to the exciting part of the offseason. That may be coming just as early as next week. Before we wrap up our show, I want to give a shout out to something we are very excited about in the Locked On Podcast Network, and that's that we've launched the first ever National Sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever National Sports 24/7 streaming channel. So that is something you need to go to right after this podcast episode. Go over to Locked On Sports Today and subscribe on YouTube. Before we wrap things up, I want to talk about somebody or a few players that might have an increased role in 2024. That's next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. Also live on TikTok and Instagram at Locked_on_Royals. Well, there's always things you can improve on when you're a team like the Royals. We know the holes on this roster. We know what the state of the pitching department is. We know where the minor league department is. All of these things across the board have to be improved. I think there are bright spots, but there's not enough bright spots. And going back to our very first segment of All-Star Breakouts, how this team can be competitive in 2024, how this team can get out to a hot start in April, how this team can stay within striking distance until July. It's not just what we brought up in All-Star Representatives. It's not just finding a closer, which was our second segment. A lot of it is going to come down to depth. Do they have enough depth to get through the season? Because here is a big issue with this team. And this goes even if they, are aggressive in free agency. If they are aggressive in the trade route, there's not much to trade. But let's say they go out and spend more than they have in the last couple of years combined, and they assemble a pretty good bullpen, they assemble a decent enough rotation, and the lineup, is pretty top heavy. All right, what happens if somebody goes down? What happens if your top arm in the rotation? I mean, I hate to say it, but we need to bring it up. What happens if Cole Reagans has a flare-up? He's had 2 Tommy John surgeries before. What happens if he goes down? Can you trust anybody to fill that spot? That's why I think it's important to make sure depth is provided. That depth is going to be a necessity. And J.J. Picollo mentioned that in his season in review press conference. They want to add depth to the pitching rotation. That if you have a guy that can't go, he can't start, you feel comfortable handing the ball over to this guy. One of the main reasons that Cleveland has always just been competitive, even in the aftermath of the World Series appearance back in 2016, why they were so good in 17, why they were continuously good in 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. They didn't make the postseason last year, but they were competing all the way up into September. It's because of their depth. They always seem to have a guy step in and give them really good innings. The Royals are going to need that, whether it be in the bullpen or it be in the rotation. I could sit here and say guys like Nick Lofton need to have an increased role. I think that goes without saying. Maybe a dark horse candidate like Samad Taylor could have a breakout year. He needs an increased role. Maybe Dairon Blanco. Dairon Blanco is a lot better than people think he really is. To me, though, it's on the pitching side of things. And the number one candidate for me to get an increased role, but maybe in a different spot, is Alec Marsh. I said this a couple weeks back in kind of assembling this rotation. I believe the Royals will have a brand new number one. I still believe that. I think the Royals are going to go out there and get their number one, whether that be Seth Lugo, whether that be a Jack Flaherty, whether that be a Martin Perez. They are going to sign somebody who has given a substantial amount of innings to a team before. They're not going to put all of their chips in one basket and say a guy who's never done it before, he's going to be our number one. That's not to say he can't be the number one by the end of the year, but they're not going to do that. So I think there's going to be a number one, and I think there's going to be a number 4 added to this rotation. So you have an ace, quote unquote. You've got a number 4 man, kind of a swing man, if you will. Then you need that 5 spot. I think Alec Marsh needs to be that guy to step up. And if it's not Alec Marsh, it's probably going to have to be Daniel Lynch. And if it ain't Daniel Lynch, the last option I think I would realistically have is if Chris Bubich all of a sudden came back healthy. And if he can't do it, then I think it all comes back to the guy who gave you the biggest workload, showed you the most upside, and that's Alec Marsh. All 3 of those guys, I think, are going to have some form of an increased role. But if they can't cut it, that increased role is non-existent. There is no role for those guys because the Royals are going to turn to guys that can give them depth. And if you can't provide depth, if you can't provide a sense of relief, there's no need to have you on the roster. Last year, I think the Royals were asking for a little bit more from somebody like a Chris Bubich. And I think he was showing that early on in the year until he got hurt. And then he missed the rest of the year. I think they were putting a little bit more faith in Daniel Lynch when he came back. And then he got hurt again. And the numbers weren't that good to begin with. And those things, when it boils down to it, you've got a guy like Alec Marsh who did stay healthy. And no, the numbers do not jump off the screen. I don't think the numbers are that impressive. The strikeout numbers are, the swing and misses, and his, I guess, effectiveness with the slider, the curveball, it generates a lot of swing and miss. And that is vitally important coming from a number 5 man. You don't need 200 innings from your 5 man. You need 160 good innings from your 5 man. And that increased role for him, I think, is going to be very, very important going into 2024. Well, that is going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. You can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. Also, give us a follow on TikTok and Instagram at Locked_on_Royals. Before we do conclude things here, one last shout out to the Locked On Sports Today channel that gives you 24/7 streaming, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts on Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Tomorrow, we're going to break down some more Rule 5 picks. We're going to look to some guys that might be able to join the bullpen, maybe have an outside chance of the rotation, or maybe a corner outfield bat that they could find instead of going through free agency. But until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.